Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this book launch for We Are Present, Women's Histories of Conflict, Courage, and Survival. My name is Sarah Case, and I'm a Deputy Program Director for the Global Initiative for Justice, Truth, and Reconciliation at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. By way of introduction, for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Sites of Conscience is the only global network of historic sites, museums, and memory initiatives that connect past struggles to today's movements for human rights and social justice. Founded in 1999, we now have over 300 members in 65 countries, from Ellis Island in New York City to former centers of detainment in Argentina to sites that remember and learn from the transatlantic slave trade in West Africa. We support these sites in a variety of ways, including grants, networking, joint programs, and training. In 2014, Sites of Conscience launched the Global Initiative for Justice, Truth, and Reconciliation, or the GIJTR, which is a consortium of 9 international organizations focused on offering holistic, integrated, and multidisciplinary approaches to issues of truth, justice, and reconciliation. GIJTR works primarily with local populations, civil society organizations, survivors, and governments to develop transitional justice approaches that are victim-centered, collaborative, and support dignity, respect, inclusion, and transparency in societies emerging from conflict or periods of authoritarian rule. Since our founding, GIJTR has engaged with people from 72 countries, worked with 681 civil society organizations, conducted 323 community-driven projects, supported the documentation of over 5,040 human rights violations, and produced over 30 publications. For more information, including how to join our network, please visit our websites at sitesofconscience.org and gijtr.org. Before I introduce our topic and our guest for today, I'd like to let attendees know that we anticipate that the session will last for approximately 1 hour. If you wish to submit a comment or a question, you may do so at any time in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. There will be a designated Q&A session toward the end of the book launch. During that time, you may also raise your hand if you wish to speak, and we'll unmute you. Just as a reminder, if you could please make sure that your sound is muted while we're going through the book launch, that would be much appreciated. And we'd also encourage you to switch to speaker view for the best viewing experience. And finally, if you have any technical problems during the meeting, please reach out to my colleague Camilla through the chat option, and we'll do our best to assist you as soon as possible. So with those important details out of the way, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this virtual book launch of We Are Present, Women's Histories of Conflict, Courage, and Survival, and a conversation with the book's editor, Radhika Hedyarachi. We Are Present, Women's Histories of Conflict, Courage, and Survival is a collection of women's experiences of conflict and its impact in Sri Lanka, published by the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. The narratives, self-written through visual storytelling methodologies, are interspersed with essays by women writers. The book shines a light on the historical threads that tie women's war experiences to the contemporary challenges women face in post-war Sri Lanka, experiences and challenges that will resonate with many communities throughout the world. In doing so, We Are Present serves as a tool for public discourse on why women's histories matter and why they must occupy a nexus between history, memorialization, and justice, particularly for those transitioning from a context of war to peace. Joining me in this discussion, I'm delighted to introduce the book's editor, Radhika Hedyarachi. Radhika is a researcher, curator, and peace-building practitioner working on oral history and memory, socioeconomic stability, conflict transformation, and peace building, with over 16 years of experience working in Sri Lanka. In partnership with the Veluthu Center, Radhika designed Her Stories, a virtual collection of 285 oral histories of war-affected women from Sri Lanka, and the first women's oral history collection to be archived at the National Archives of Sri Lanka. Radhika also conceptualized and co-founded the Community Memorialization Project, which archives people's lived experiences of conflict to inspire facilitated dialogue, especially intergenerational dialogue, with the goal of creating empathy and strengthening community resilience for non-recurrence of violent conflict. In 2021, with the support from the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, Radhika curated Shared Journeys, a regional exhibition across 7 countries in Asia that challenges dominant narratives of power by showcasing hidden, lost, or marginalized histories. She has worked at UNDP, International Alert, and Search for Common Ground on development and peace building, and holds a master's in development management from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome, Radhika, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Lovely to see you. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll just get started with the discussion questions, unless there's anything you'd like to add first.
Oh, actually, yes. I'd like to, just before I begin, I would like to thank the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience for all the support with this publication, and for truly being an excellent long-term partner in our work on memory and justice and peace building. There are many other organizations and individuals I need to thank, including the collaborators of the 4 projects represented in this book, mainly Bilindu Center for Human Resource Management, Search for Common Ground, Grassrooted Trust, and the Institute of Social Development. I have to thank the editorial team, the writers, the reviewers, researchers, all of whom appear by name in the acknowledgements of the book. And above all else, I'm incredibly grateful that so many amazing women collaborated by sharing their life experiences for this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika. We'll get started with our discussion questions then. So first, I'd like to ask, in the foreword by former Undersecretary General of the UN, Radhika Coomaraswamy, there's a sentence that reads, "The individual citizen until recently had no history at all but that of being invisible, the collateral damage of violence and hatred." How do you think that a memory initiative like this, made up of deeply personal stories from women affected by conflict, can contribute to broader transitional justice goals of truth-seeking, justice, and non-recurrence?
Firstly, I'm incredibly grateful to Radhika Coomaraswamy for writing the forward to this reference book. Her involvement in the project is such an honor for us. In answer to your question, every post-war context is different. The causes are different, its impact, and the processes required to transition from a period of conflict to one of sustainable peace is different. But one common thread that ties them is that in the aftermath of it, all but a few individuals affected disappear from the grand narratives of victory and defeat. When the Sri Lankan war ended, the nation-building priorities of the government at the time, which was swift economic recovery, development of war-affected regions, and pacifying some of the post-war anxieties of the majority community, meant that the process of nation-building involved selecting, legitimizing narratives of war that served to strengthen the victor's right to rule. And the cost of that was reckoning with Sri Lanka's difficult past and the root causes of conflict, which basically meant that it goes without deeper societal interrogation. Even more dangerously, if and when these one-sided narratives are activated, especially as national memorialization in the public sphere, especially when there is political capital at stake, they can erase dissenting voices, and particularly the voices of the vulnerable, which includes women. However, sometimes there's legitimacy given to some women's narratives at the cost of others, and that highlights the patriarchal nature of how memory is constructed in the public sphere. The near absence of women, except perhaps the use of women as victims or mothers in these historical narratives, in these grand narratives of history, is something that Shamara Vethamuni highlights in her essay in this book. And this is one of the reasons why creating space for a more personal and autoethnographic narrative becomes necessary. For many women, breaking the silence is a deliberate choice, not just in validating their experiences and their life histories, but also in activating their political legacy, their agency, and also in the cathartic act of voicing their memories. This is why lived experiences through storytelling and personal narrative becomes a useful tool as it moves beyond the facts and aggregates of a more official version of history. In telling one's own lived experience, the woman also has the ability to control her own narrative, and many truths are able to coexist, thereby contesting the very notion of that one truth. And without women's oral histories, gendered perspectives of war, peace, justice, security are incomplete. And you asked about how this contributes to truth, justice, and non-recurrence. And that's an interesting question in terms of understanding the nature of truth and justice post-war. The process of justice in the context of truth-seeking itself might frame and shape the resultant narratives, and it might place certain labels on women. Ambika Satkunanathan, in her essay in this book, talks about the nature of justice and women's agency in defining for herself what type of justice she seeks, and the importance of understanding perspective in pushing our notions of justice beyond the boundaries that we envision. And just as multiple truths or vantage points can exist about a single event, truth itself can take many forms. History may be eyewitness accounts, it may be testimonials of what an event or what one has seen, but there is always emotion attached to it. And in the context of fleshing out history and contextualizing it, the voices of women as they speak their own truths provides a nuanced glimpse into the socioeconomic, political, or conflict landscape of time and a place that goes beyond the historical moment. So as a record of history, these women's narratives add validity and an important perspective and sits in parallel with the transitional justice process.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And as you said, I think, the importance of these multiple truths existing side by side and providing context to the dominant historical narrative is so important and something we see across many different contexts. For the second question, I'd like to ask, the book itself represents a fraction of the hundreds of stories you've been closely involved in documenting through the Her Stories Project, the Community Memorialization Project, and the Women Sex Workers in Conflict Project, as well as curating in the Body Remembers Project. Why do you think it is important to share these stories now, particularly during such a time of such significant socioeconomic crisis in Sri Lanka?
Well, it is an unusual context right now with what's going on in Sri Lanka. And with what's going on, historical injustices and experiences that highlight the diverse challenges and needs of the peoples of Sri Lanka become all the more important. Systemic violence and oppression has a capacity to erase or marginalize or manipulate histories. And as a result, there's always an innovative ways of facilitating inclusive conversations. And having an insight into these multiple histories and a critical distance from it, whether as the next generation or us as society, creates that emotional space that we need to accommodate these views and the needs of the political and social other. And of course, timing and sequence is everything. And the disappearance of memories as well as the remembering of them is important for Sri Lanka right now because it keeps this particular conversation visible.
Absolutely. I think we may have lost our connection for just a moment, but we'll wait for Radhika to rejoin us.
I'm so sorry. I think I got...
No worries.
I got disconnected. I'm sorry. Where was I? What was I just talking? Was it for too long or?
No, please. Please.
I basically think that right now in Sri Lanka, there's a need to keep this particular conversation visible. And obviously at this particular juncture, there's different groups who wouldn't otherwise come together in the same space, coming together for a common goal. But the idea of consensus can be a dangerous thing, thinking that this crisis can speak for a deep-rooted differences, deep-rooted experiences and needs of everyone has a certain naivety about it. While the citizen and youth-led public uprising has raised many questions on governance, on financial prudency, on corruption, cronyism, some people for the first time seeing brutality and militarism, the groups are also fluid and heterogeneous, and the rallying call around unity for system change doesn't necessarily address the past injustices, because they need to be more visible. So the numerical majority who may connect with an essentially singular Buddhist identity may be questioning the deterioration of governance in Sri Lanka, but they still may only be seeing this from an economic crisis point of view, the lack of fuel, the lack of cooking gas, medicine, and unbearable rising cost of living. But in all of this, there is still an undercurrent of a dominant ideology. So this conversation, it needs to be deepened, and we need to build up a question and an idea or a conversation around the idea of what conditions led a leadership that is built around nationalistic ideologies and at times a lack of respect for rights to be elected in the first place. So there is a brief window of opportunity to open up that space for reflection and recognition and re-examination of this undercurrent of nationalism. Especially with these calls of unity, they exclude the conversation about having a unified voice, but understanding that we are not all equal, that we have had very different and inequitable access to resources, peace, and justice. And in that sense, coalescing on many expectations, whether they are socioeconomic, political, or needs of justice, under one goal is problematic. It ignores the privilege that came with, and for some still come with, where the South may have been genuinely ignorant or willfully silent about the atrocities of the past against our own civilians. And these are many conflicts. There are many conflicts that Sri Lanka has had since the 70s. And to this effect, Ramla Wahab Salman, she talks in the book about women's histories as having an indelible link to how contemporary politics and governance is shaped. And in the last essay of this book, it highlights why historical injustices need to be consciously brought into every conversation about justice, development, politics, peace. And there are real implications, especially for women, as they relate to contemporary challenges, especially now. That is not to say that there isn't much more to unpack on the politics of memory in Sri Lanka, but that warrants a really, really long conversation.
Thanks so much, Radhika. I think you bring up a really important point that on the surface, it might seem like this is sort of a new socioeconomic challenge, but it's really important to fight to continue bringing those historical injustices into the present conversation and examining the links there. So I'd like to next move on to something that you highlighted briefly also in your response to the first question and in the introduction to the book, where you highlighted some of the ethical questions that you grappled with in relation to what you described the projectization of memory and the way in which this affects the storytellers, the kinds of stories they're allowed to tell, and whose stories are prioritized. Could you talk about some of these concerns and how you balance them with the need to create spaces for women to tell their stories as a counterpoint to the dominant patriarchal post-war narrative?
Well, there's a distinction between how memorialization has been practiced for centuries as an instinctive reaction to violence, grief, conflict, and memory initiatives that are more structured and more projectized in practice are different. And so organic processes of memory and memorialization happen all the time. It happens during, before, and even after conflict. And this is what Vasuki Jayasankar talks about in her essay in this book. about spaces and practices of women where ritual becomes memorialization. But with memory initiatives, as with any other methodology, there are weaknesses and benefits. But it doesn't mean that it isn't useful and it needs to be excluded. It can coexist. And if we are sensitive to the ethical considerations that emerge in its way, then it is important to also problematize the work we do and keep problematizing it and analyzing it so that we can at least respond to those ethical challenges as we go along. So in practicing these memorialization projects as a public good, for example, as historical record or a catalyst for dialogue on peace and justice and non-recurrence of violent conflict, we had many ethical concerns and challenges that emerged that we as teams discussed and tried to find the best way possible to mitigate. And some of these challenges that we've grappled with were in relation to how to make sure the right to remember and the right to forget is honored. And the ability to choose, the participants' ability to choose on what is remembered and how, and whether such a choice truly exists within a memorialization project. For example, long-term attachments to NGOs or projects may sort of create a certain inability to say no to something like this when asked to participate in a project. So it's always a challenge to see if there's genuine and meaningful participation and collaboration. So rather than sort of almost an incentivized kind of participation. So it's one of those challenges that springs up all the time, and it calls for us to be sensitive to it. Safety and security of the individuals was a concern, and it still is. Stigmatization, mental health implications or societal consequences of expressing themselves publicly was also a concern. And then there's also unachievable requests to us where, for example, about the missing or the disappeared. And this basically means that we need to direct and refer them to other people, but we cannot give them that answer. So it's very difficult ethically as well to listen to this kind of request and not be able to answer that question. And then, of course, and this relates to something I spoke about earlier, whether it's an extractive exercise or whether there's, even if there isn't a financial benefit that's given for sharing stories, whether the long-term attachment to NGOs or partners that we work with, whether that creates a certain sort of inability to say no. So that is one of the challenges that we constantly grapple with. And as I said before, timing and sequence becomes all the more important in ensuring that memorialization isn't imposed upon the unwilling. But some of the ways in which we try to manage these challenges as best as possible was to ensure that we had certain protocols in place while we were doing these projects. So for example, participation was always voluntary and on their own terms, in their own time, in their own homes, if possible. And in addition, the processes of documentation was always autoethnographic, meaning that the person writes their own histories and in life history formats. So it's not just a simple sort of question and answer format or about a specific event, it is a life history. So they're able to tell their whole history, their whole story. And in this way, they ensure that there is very little room for intrusion or interpretation and mediation of their story and representation of their story in a way that is different. So it allows for self-censorship if they want, and a certain amount of control, or actually absolute control of their own narrative. And then the other thing is, of course, informed consent and the ability to withdraw their narratives at any point. Approaching the community through community leaders and trusted counterparts with long-term relationships is another way to manage the risks, because they would know the cultural context and the risks that are specifically relevant to those people, to the communities where these women live. So approaching the women, but also working with their community to try and understand those risks are important, and we try to manage that at all points. We try to make all of the projects a multi-year process, or worked with programming that was multi-year, so that there was relationships built and connections built, and we would leave the communities empowered rather than making it an extractive process. The other thing we tried to do was to always go beyond archiving, where we would try to make it a process long after the archiving is over, where we connect individuals to each other, refer to other programs, and try and build up a system of facilitated dialogues that went beyond the archiving process, so that there was more to it than just recording histories. Of course, no promises or remuneration or reciprocity was ever offered, and we always tried to connect, where possible, mental health care services that were available locally, and if not, referred to other systems which were available for them. So the bottom line here is that, I mean, there is a need for a thoughtful and praxis that deliberately builds in systems of support to the community, and that calls for a deeper context analysis and clear and sensitive protocols whenever we engage in memorialization. So that's what we try to do.
Thank you, Radhika. I think those are all really practical and instructive tips for all of us to consider, as I know these kinds of questions come up frequently in the work we're doing, but what you shared, especially around the longevity of the relationships, the transparency with which you approach things, and working through trusted community partners, I think those are really instructive points. Next, I'd like to ask, you noted in the preface that in making this book, you revisited some of the women whose narratives you documented nearly a decade ago, starting in 2012. Could you talk about that experience, what it was like to go back and speak with them after so many years, any reflections they shared from their participation in the project, and how their feelings may or may not have changed toward the stories they shared?
Yeah, I mean, while there was always permission from when we were working with the communities, there was always permission from a decade ago as well as 5 years ago and 1 year ago, when I was working with these women, to publicly share their stories, sometimes anonymously, sometimes with their faces and names, because some women really wanted to make sure that they were known and they were not afraid. So there was always permission, but the nature of consent in a context as complex and dynamic as ours in Sri Lanka includes angles on and security perspectives that is changeable. So it's kind of important to understand that these life histories don't actually stand in a vacuum. They belong to real people, and real people have the agency to decide what they want to do with their stories. So if it means withdrawal, or if it means, yes, share them in a book, well, we have to ask them. So that is why we did this series of visits to these women, again, in order to inform them and to ask them to renew their consent, if that is what they chose. So it was a really interesting experience, because some people had moved away, some had sadly passed away, some were exactly where we had met them. And some of the CBOs that we had partnered had also disappeared and no longer existed. But the community leaders were there, and so they gave us the support to approach these women together. And at the time we were doing the original projects, for security reasons, we had decided to not hold on to their names and addresses. So it was really difficult to look for these women, because we were going by landmarks, which had actually really changed as well. So we were driving from village to village to try and find one person who would connect us to another person, and it went on like that. So we did find a lot of the women. And this gave us an opportunity to update their life histories as well, and what happened to them in the intervening years, but also to share with them how we worked with their stories and how many people had seen them, and the intergenerational dialogues that they generated. And most of the women really loved to hear what had happened to them. And it was really nice to see them, because there was always this reminiscing about what what it was like when we recorded the stories, showing pictures of their children and the prizes that they had won, and the fact that some people were getting married soon, and it was really interesting, and it was very good to see that for most of them, their lives seem to have gotten better in way economically and materially, and the houses were bigger and better, and they seemed to be well. But that didn't mean that their desire for justice or equality or a better life for their children had changed. And there were also moments that were difficult. Like, for example, one woman chose to withdraw her story. It's redacted in the book and it's removed from the archive to respect her wishes. But her life circumstances had changed and she wanted to forget what had happened to her before. So she wanted that particular story withdrawn, and she only wanted to be remembered for what she is now. And that's her choice. And it has always been her choice, because the story owners are always the people who tell these stories. And some women shared their thoughts on why it was a good thing that the next generation saw these stories, and why they would develop a conversation around it, and they wanted to keep going with that. And for some, while they still wanted to share their stories publicly and have them in the book, they did highlight that the security challenges in the context, particularly in the North, was still the same. And so they wanted the anonymity maintained. One woman was particularly vocal, and it was very interesting to talk to. It was jarring as well, because she was particularly vocal about the benefit to her and her family of sharing her story, because she never received any monetary compensation. I mean, she knew this when she collaborated as well, and she admitted she knew this, but still, she didn't want to withdraw her story, and she didn't mind it being made public, and she wanted it to be made public, but she basically didn't care if her life story triggered any societal benefits in terms of peace building or whether it completed a historical record. Her stories, her case was very interesting, because her experiences and perhaps the culture and nature of being a long-term NGO beneficiary had colored her perspective to think of everything from a transactional point of view. Of course, that's an entirely different conversation, but it was an interesting dimension to understand when we think about consent and when we think about the notion of agency. But overall, revisiting the women highlighted how important informed consent was, and how interesting it was to see them after 10 years and after 5 years, and how much their lives had changed. I mean, their lives had changed so much from a material point of view. The roads were developed, houses were developed, villages were developed, but the fact that there was still some women demanding answers was an indictment of our systems of governance, accountability, justice, and politics as a whole, because those have not been addressed. And this is, again, why these conversations are still important today, and it is still probably will be important for the next generation as well.
Absolutely. And, it sounds like a real challenging challenge going back, after so many years to find these women, I can only imagine, but also such an amazing opportunity, because I think we think about these memory initiatives and their longer and medium term impacts, but you don't always have that opportunity to go back and speak with people and see, how their views on their participation and their hopes have changed. So that's so interesting. I think we have time for one more question before we get to our excerpt reading. So I'd like to ask, in many of our workshops and exchanges on memorialization at sites of conscience, we've observed that the process that goes into the creation of a grassroots or community memorialization project is often equally, if not more important than the final outcome, particularly for survivors and victims' family members. Could you describe the different methodologies that you and your colleagues use to work with the women whose stories have been documented in the book?
Yeah, so a lot of these methodologies are like, all of them actually are life history formats, meaning that they focus on the entire history rather than a particular question or a particular point in a person's life. And the one of the methodologies that works really well with women's histories is handwritten letters. So they're sourced from each woman directly from their homes, and that actually means that by visiting each of these women and giving them the space to write it whenever and however and wherever they choose, keeps women's histories and the way the woman tells a story quite personal and her own. And it means that there's very little intrusion from particularly men, especially in contexts where there's a restrictive space for women to tell their stories. And for example, there's one in the book that's about 17 pages long. I mean, it's not in the book, it's edited, but if you look at the QR code, it'll take you to the original, and it's about 17 pages long. So the woman can write whatever she wants, however she wants, but it also, you will see that in some of them, they're scratched out. So, there's an opportunity to self-censor as well. But what the letter writing format does is it gives you an addressable other, and it's the least mediated form of writing because or the least mediated form of life history, because there is very little distance from the person who writes it and the person who reads it. There is very little intrusion. So that's one of the methodologies that was used. Then visual expression methodologies like memory maps, which basically meant that a group of women, friends or community members or women working in an organization would sit together and they would write these stories individually but together. So in one color, you will see one woman's story, but if you look at the whole, what it does is it provides a picture of a time and a place. Because it's many vantage points in a way. So that's one methodology. Then and it helps a lot when you're talking about when in contexts where there were very difficult events or incidents that happened, incidents of violence and so on. The trees of life formats are individual formats, and again, it's one woman's history. But what's really useful and important about this methodology is that as a woman traces her whole life history, particularly for women in the North, for example, who have been displaced many times, they are able to root their life and their family's histories by saying, my father was from here, my mother was from here. And especially when land is lost and it's something that actually matters so much to your identity, the ability to root yourself over time and say, this is who I am, is important, because you never know if you'll get it back. And there are stories in here where people haven't got it back. So the land issue is something that actually is very important. And this process, particularly in that context, is useful. And the other thing about Trees of Life that's really interesting is that at the end of it, we ask a woman to look back at her whole history and think of what it means to her. And most often, we don't actually, when telling our stories, we don't actually take a step back and think about what it means for who we are. And this format offers that option. And most of the women talk about how they value their own courage, how they see themselves as strong people, not as victims. I did this methodology in Afghanistan as well, and it was really interesting there as well, because that for a lot of women there, who, for example, taught young children to read and write during the Taliban, it was the first time they saw themselves as heroes rather than victims. So it's a very interesting format that offers that option of building self-esteem while working on histories. Body maps is a technique that ISD used together with Shirley Gunn, where you imagine women's experiences literally as remembered in their body, the scars that are visible, and metaphorically with the scars that are not visible. I participated and curated the body maps and exhibition and dialogue process, and it's a very powerful format because it's life size, and it's a very visual but visceral experience. Then some of the other methodologies in terms of photo essays, videos, and audio interviews, they're the least, actually what I would say is they're the most mediated form, because there is a dialogue and there is an interview process that happens, and there's quite a bit of editing to make it fit a certain time period. But of course, the entire collection, and the entire interview is actually deposited at the National Archives and that's actually one of the reasons that a lot of the women participated in these projects, because they wanted their stories to be in the National Archives, and they are. So the entire collection is there, but it is edited for the exhibition, so it's the most mediated form, and it is only for forms where women want their faces to be seen. So those are some of the methodologies that have fed this book.
Thanks so much, Radhika. Such an interesting kind of collection of different techniques, and to see them all here together in the book. The visuals that you mentioned, they're also quite striking. So I hope everyone who hasn't had a chance to see the book yet will be able to download it, and we'll share more information on that at the end of the event. Now I'd like to make time if there are any questions from our attendees. You're welcome to put your questions in the group chat, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand function on Zoom, and we'll unmute you. I see we have one question from my colleague, Devin. Devin asks, she's curious if Radhika could speak to the symbolism behind the cover image and how it links to the content of the book. Radhika, could you share your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Devin. The cover image actually is quite interesting. I don't know if you can show that, Camilla, but it is it's an artwork by a woman artist from the north called Hema Shironi, and her practice is usually with stitching and sewing, and this is a really interesting one as it relates to the book as well, because what she's depicting there is her grandmother's land, and she's sewn everything that her grandmother buried over the years, including what she buried when she had to leave the land. And she says that there are basically layers and layers and layers of history that are buried in her land, and including what things that are very powerful and mean a lot to her. So bits of family history, belongings, all of that. And when the grandmother left, it took her 20 years to come back to it, and she says. And there's a description in the book as well about this. But so she says it took her 20 years to come back to that place, and most of this was no more. The earth had swallowed it, and it had disappeared. So what she has depicted here as an artist only exists in the stories that are passed down between the grandmother to her mother to Shironi, and now perhaps to her own daughter that she had 3 weeks ago. Called Amy. So this is a beautiful artwork, because it shows that history, tangible history, which was once there, could be completely lost, but they still survive in the form of stories that are passed down from generation to generation. So memory lives in a way. So it's quite beautiful, and I thought it related really well to this particular book, and she was very happy to share it. So I have to thank her for that.
Thanks so much, Radhika. That really is a beautiful image, and thank you, Devin, for the question. Are there any other questions from our audience members? If not, or while people are gathering, oh, I see. So we have a question from Tanya in the audience. She's wondering if there are any more recent stories other than the updated ones. So I think about the timeline of the stories included in the book, if there are more recent stories there.
Yes, there are stories from 10 years ago, there's stories from 5 years ago, and there are women's experiences, particularly women's sex workers' experiences from last year. and the body maps are from about 2018. But as I said, when we went back to talk to the women and to renew their consent, a lot of people shared updates about their lives. So that is from 2021 and 22. So that's very recent. So there are updates that are included in the book as well about where these women are today and how they feel about their own stories. Context. So yeah, so there's a sort of a constant renewal, not just of the content, but of how they feel about stories, and to be part of a process of, in a way, history making.
Thank you, Radhika, and thank you for the question. So it really spans quite a number of years. I see we have another question in the chat. This will probably be our last one. So this is from Catherine Stone. It says, thank you very much to Radhika for this inspiring and deeply reflective talk. You spoke very eloquently about the need to account for how survivors' needs and approaches to memorialization change over time. Against this background, do you have any thoughts about the extent to which individual memory projects are by nature quite transitory or ephemeral? Is there a need to create more lasting or institutionalized memories? Thinking, for example, about the traditional exclusion of women's stories from memory institutions, museums, and memorials. Do you have any thoughts on this, Radhika?
I think, I mean, it's always, they are transitory in that, you know, they happen during a project period, and then obviously, as Catherine mentioned as well, they change over time, not just in terms of context, but what you remember and how you remember it. And of course, we can't forget that the memorialization always happens in the present, and the present political, socioeconomic context affects what you want to say and what you want to remember. So yes, it is time bound, and in a sense, with oral history, putting it down actually reduces its fluidity. I mean, maybe memory is meant to evolve and change, but of course, putting it down and institutionalizing it in a way, in a structured way, impedes that process because it crystallizes that. So I think there are challenges either way, but I think they can coexist. The practice of memory from a ritualistic point of view, where you pass it on to your families at a community level, and the practice of creating and constructing these women's histories and keep institutionalizing, for example, keeping it in the National Archives or on website or in other memory spaces, they can coexist. And I think both are very important. There is a sort of an ephemeral nature to the fluidity of memory in a community setting. But having this kind of memory that keeps it in an institutionalized space offers future generations the opportunity and the critical distance to be able to examine it, especially where dominant histories and dominant narratives have taken root. This is a way, the people's histories can actually enable people once we're gone to actually contextualize. So I think both processes are quite valid and important to coexist.
Thanks so much, Radhika, and thank you to Catherine for the really interesting question. I see we now have just about 5 minutes left in our conversation, so I'll move into the conclusion shortly, but Radhika, I just want to give you an opportunity. If there's anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up, please go ahead.
I think I'm okay. Thank you so much, actually. Thank you so much for supporting this process, and thank you for being amazing throughout the process.
Well, thank you.
Really appreciate that. I really appreciate all the women who've been part of this process from ICSC, but also just to note that this book is a feminist project. Every single person involved in it, from the design to editing to writing to reviewing, has been a woman. So it's been a very fulfilling experience.
Well, and thank you to you. I think this is really such a beautiful work, and I can't wait for many others to view it and share it with all of them. So in conclusion, I'd like to just close with another quote from the book's foreword by Radhika Coomaraswamy, which reads, The construction of memory after a terrible war is an occasion to reimagine and create a new vision of who we are. Memory is not only the art of remembering, but also a process of creation. It is therefore a force of power and strength. So I'd like to thank you, Radhika, and all of the women who shared their stories for your power and your strength and your contributions to this effort, and for allowing us the space to reflect on these memories and for the insights you've shared with us here today. Thank you as well to everyone who's been listening and participating in this conversation. As I've mentioned, I'd like to invite you all to download the book free of charge at academia.edu. We're also offering it free of charge to interested partner institutions and libraries, so you're welcome to get in touch with us about that as well. Lastly, I'd like to welcome you to check out our other events at sitesofconscience.org and gijtr.org, and to join us in this conversation by following us on social media and sharing your thoughts and reflections there. Thank you so much to everyone. I hope you all have a good evening, a good morning, good day, wherever it is there, and we look forward to connecting with you all again soon. Thank you, Radhika.